Good morning. All right. Good time to begin our Bible class this morning. For those of you in the foyer, please go ahead and make your way to your classroom so we can get started. First of all, I want to welcome our visitors and also those that are watching on the streaming, because this is our first Bible class where we're going to be streaming live over the website. So welcome to all those who are watching. For those of you that may be new to this class, we've been looking and doing our study out of 1 Samuel. Today we'll be getting to chapters 22 and 23 of 1 Samuel. But first of all, we'll go ahead and get started with a little review from last week. As we started chapter 21, we saw that David was a man without a country. He was fleeing, and he actually fled to Nob, the city of the priests, a few miles to the north and east of Jerusalem. He was fleeing to get away from Saul because Saul had made it clear through Jonathan that he intended to do David harm. So when David gets to Nob, he meets up with Ahimelech, and at this time we're told that Ahimelech comes up to meet David, and he's trembling when he meets him. And he also is wondering why David is alone. David tells the priest he is on a special secret mission, an assignment for King Saul. And he elaborates that he could not even describe this mission to Ahimelech. Having fled directly from his meeting with Jonathan, David had no food, he had no weaponry, he had nothing with him. So he then asks Ahimelech for food and for weapons. David had some real needs. But instead of trusting in God in this situation, we see that David used his own wits and deceit to get those needs fulfilled. Ahimelech offers David some loaves of consecrated bread, with the condition that the men had been kept pure, which David then did agree that was the case, so Ahimelech did give him the bread. And then Ahimelech offered David Goliath's sword. So David, knowing that Doeg would tell Saul of his location, he then fled Nob and went to Gath and met with Achish. David here did an interesting thing where he fled to the land of the Philistines. He left the people of God to go to the enemies of God. David sought sanctuary in the hometown of Goliath, who he killed. We see in that story that David actually became fearful of Achish, and got a nice little misspelling there on the slide there. But he became fearful of Achish, and so he fled again. And this time, to get away, he acted like he was insane. We are told that he scribbled on the doors of the gate and let saliva run down on his beard. While at this point, Achish was not too inclined to let David stick around, so he allowed him to leave. And that's where we closed out chapter 21, where David departed Gath and went to the cave of Adullam. And that's where we'll pick up today in chapter 22. We could summarize this chapter as Saul completely loses his mind. That's one way of putting it. There's a lot of different ways you could label chapter 22, but for the theme this morning, I wanted to talk about he's lost his mind. Some of you have probably heard this story, but I believe it's a good way to start off our class this morning, even a little bit of humor. In preparation for this class, I read a story of an elderly person who was bemoaning those things which come with age. She said, "I don't mind so much that I have to take off my glasses at night. I don't even mind so much that I have to take my teeth out for the night. And then there's my hearing aid, which I also have to deposit on the nightstand. I don't miss the loss of good sight, good teeth, and good hearing so much, but I sure do miss my mind. And those of us who are not quite so to the point of age where we're wondering if we're losing our eyes and everything else, we all come to the point where we wonder if we're losing our minds. And after what we've studied the past several weeks, we could say that if anyone should be missing his mind, it's Saul. Up to this point in our study, we have seen that Saul has had his problems in life. He was delighted to find David, who could play his harp and soothe his troubled spirit, in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. He also rejoiced greatly with David when he took on Goliath and won, in chapter 17. But when the women of Israel began to sing their song of celebration, giving David greater honor than Saul, the king began to look upon David with suspicion. Quickly overtaken by jealousy, Saul tried to kill David in a way that would not make him look bad before the people. But before long, the king gave orders to his servants to kill David. Jonathan talked him out of his plans for a short time, but it did not last long. Soon, Saul was hurling a spear at his own son, in chapter 20. By various means, God spared David's life, but it eventually became necessary for him to flee from the king's presence. He first fled to Ahimelech, the high priest, who inquired of the Lord for him, and gave David some of the sacred bread, along with the sword of Goliath. When we come into chapter 22, we see a king who has completely lost his grip. He has seemingly lost his mind. Nowadays, Saul would be admitted to a mental hospital or at least heavily medicated for what he's doing. His fits of depression and jealousy appear to become more intense and more frequent. Now he seems to be a constant state of fear and jealousy, interspread with fleeting moments of sanity. In the text we'll be looking at today, we will see that Saul reaches an all-time low. We will see that Saul's fear of David drives him to begin killing innocent people. Here his jealous rage drives him in order to kill the priesthood, which is an almost unthinkable thing. And for the purpose of review here, I want to review Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 through 13, which gave instructions for the priests. Beginning in verse 8. If any case is too difficult for you to decide between one kind of homicide or another, between one kind of lawsuit or another, and between one kind of assault or another, being cases of dispute in your courts, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. So you shall come to the Levitical priest or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them and say, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. You shall do according to the terms of the verdict which they declare to you from that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to observe according to all that they teach you. According to the terms of the law which they teach you, and according to the verdict which they will tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you, to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not listening to the priest who stands there to serve the Lord your God, nor to the judge, that man shall die. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid, and will not act presumptuously again. King Saul is not about to just kill one priest, but he's going to make an attempt to execute all the priests and their families, in spite of these words God gave Israel. This morning we will see how Saul reached the low point in his life and his leadership. But we'll also look at, see what God has for us to learn from this text. In the early portions of chapter 22, we learn that David does what he makes, got myself all messed up. David does what makes his way back to the territory of Judah. He did what he was told, but not too far from Israel's border with Philistia. He hides away in the cave of Adullam, It appears David has found a safe, secluded hideout just far enough away from Gath and not too close to Saul. In chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him, everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. Up until this point, David was alone. But when he decides to hide out in the cave of Adullam, a number of people began to arrive, hoping to associate with David. We read that David's family comes to be with him. But David's family was not the only group that came. In verse 2 it says, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. You have to figure this is a very interesting group of people. All those people that were in distress came. The Hebrew word for distress, Hebrew word means distress, under pressure, under stress. So here came hundreds of people who were stressed out. With them came those who were in debt. These were people who couldn't pay their bills. They had extended themselves too far with their creditors. And with them came those who were discontented. The Hebrew word means to be in bitterness of soul, to have been wronged or mistreated. So we have to ask ourselves here, how did these people get so distressed, indebted, and discontented? And the answer is in King Saul. Long before Saul had been anointed king, Samuel the prophet had warned them about the oppression the new monarch would bring. The people were really aching under the rule of King Saul. So we kind of wonder how David must have felt about this. One can imagine that he was not thinking this was the kind of support group he wanted. Why would God send people like this, or a group of people like this, to David? And I think there are actually several things that are going on here. First of all, from this we could take that God was preparing David to be the leader, to lead the nation. David went back to the cave to hide, but God saw it differently. Believe it or not, that dark, damp cave became a place of training for those who were in the beginning of the army that would later be called David's mighty men of valor. They were destined to win great victories that the people of God never ever enjoyed, the greatest victories that the people of God ever enjoyed. This motley crew would become his mighty men in battle and his cabinet when he took office. David rallied his group of disgruntled, disparate people and taught them discipline and character and gave them direction. David taught them the truths of God, like this one that he wrote in Psalm 34, verses 15 through 19. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. The second thing I believe we could take out of this, his hiding in the cave, is in addition to leadership, I believe David was learning compassion here. Amid his exile and his grief, and amid the distressed comrades, David was learning firsthand the frustration and anguish of the oppressed. David was developing an enormous empathy for the underprivileged of his people. Never would he be immune from the suffering of his subjects when he became their king. And it cannot be overstated enough how important it is for us to learn compassion. So this is another thing we can learn from David's story. A third thing that was happening during this period was the binding of the hearts of the people to David. This group of people that came to the cave were coming to love David with an incredible loyalty. No king had ever been put through what David was about to be put through, but in the midst of it, David was honorable and selfless. His men will come to a place of commitment to David that his wish will be their command. David will become the most beloved ruler ever to reign in Israel, for he knew fully what it was to be the underdog and to suffer among the poor and to be oppressed. Continuing on, verses 3 through 5 of 1 Samuel 22. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me." Then he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. The prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went to the forest of Hereth. It appears that when David goes to Ahimelech the high priest, one of his intentions is to obtain divine guidance. At least that is what Doeg reports to Saul. And Ahimelech seems to confirm this fact, and later on we'll see in chapter 22, verses 10 and 15. But since David conceals the fact that he is fleeing from Saul, nobody knows what guidance he received from him. But we do know that after this, David flees the country. He goes first to Gath, from which he is expelled for acting like a madman, and then to the cave at Adullam, and then on to Moab, where he leaves his father and mother and perhaps hides out himself in the stronghold. Like Melchizedek in Genesis 14, the prophet Gad appeared from out of nowhere and instructs David to not stay in the stronghold, but to go to the land of Judah. It sounds as if he is telling David to stop hiding out in the land of outside of the land of Israel. David is to find his sanctuary in Israel, specifically the territory of his own tribe, Judah. It is Judah, after all, who first accepts David as their king. See that in 2 Samuel chapter 2. David obeys Gad, making the hideout in the forest of Hereth. The exact whereabouts of this forest are not entirely clear, but from the reading of 1 Samuel 18, we can read that it is a dangerous place, one which Saul and his men are reluctant to enter. The forest seems to be to David and his men what Sherwood Forest was to Robin Hood and his men. The mention of the prophet Gad is significant in another way. Lone individuals do not have their own prophets. Even though David is in exile, he is the Lord's chosen king, and God intends to direct his steps. I think there is a contrast to take note of, and that is that Saul has lost all prophetic support, but David already has a prophet to advise him, and he's not king yet. It took faith for David to obey the voice of the prophet Gad and to leave the stronghold of security. But because of David's prompt compliance with the will of God, his life would be spared, as well as those of his men. Others were destined to be less fortunate and fall under the mad fury of Saul's cruel temper. As the rest of chapter 22 reveals, in his bitter anger, Saul will annihilate innocent priests, women, children, infants, and animals. Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech the priest, will be the only one to escape and survive, and he'll end up joining David's gang for protection. In verses 6 through 10, 1 Samuel chapter 22, then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in hand, and his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to give all of your fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." At this point, Saul he's thinking the entire world is against him and for David. The term conspired appears twice in this text. Saul comes across in verses 6 through 10 as you've all seen the character Rodney Dangerfield. At this point, he's got no respect. Everybody's against him. He accuses virtually everyone of being part of a sinister plot against him, when in reality, God is the one taking the kingdom from him due to his own sin. As a result of the guilt Saul heaps upon his servants, Doeg will inform Saul of David's visit to Ahimelech and Ahimelech's innocent compliance with David's requests. It's really no surprise that Saul accuses David of conspiring against him. After all, it is what Saul thinks, but he is wrong in accusing David of conspiracy. David is not lying in ambush, as Saul charges, waiting for the opportune moment to end Saul's life. David is in fact hiding out, seeking to avoid Saul, to escape from Saul's schemes to put him to death. What is amazing in these verses is it's the accusations Saul makes against his own son, Jonathan. Because of the covenant David made with Jonathan, we would not be surprised to read that Saul accuses his son of being taken in by David, of being recruited by David to join him in his conspiracy against Saul. But Saul actually here accuses Jonathan of leading David astray, of stirring up David against him. That's an amazing charge. The conspiracy against Saul is traced to its roots, originating and not with David. Saul is truly losing his mind here. But the conspiracy theory goes even further. Not only does Saul accuse Jonathan and David of conspiring against him, he also accuses his servants, not just one or two, but all of them. Saul is surrounded by his servants as he sits under the tamarisk tree near his home in Gibeah. He begins by reminding his servants about the nature of politics and the spoils of political victory and power. As a reward for their loyalty to Saul, these Benjamites have been given property and possessions and positions of authority as political spoils. Do they think that if David becomes the king, they will enjoy these same spoils? Probably not. And so Saul reminds his servants that they owe him. And he wants to get payback by having them inform him of David's whereabouts. Saul tells his servants about David and withholding any information about him and his whereabouts. They are in fact joining David in his conspiracy against Saul. So Doeg finds this ample reason to pass on to Saul what he observed while he was at Nob. Doeg has just recently seen David. While at Nob, we saw David arrive and have dealings with the high priest Ahimelech. The high priest inquired of the Lord for David and also gave him some sacred bread and the sword of Goliath, which he had been keeping. All of these things are true, as we see in Scripture. But Doeg does not tell Saul, and perhaps he doesn't know, is that David never informed Ahimelech that he was fleeing from Saul, We don't see that in the text anywhere. He never disclosed to the high priest anything that would make him a conspirator against Saul. But Saul is in this situation. He is not interested in the truth, not interested in learning the truth. He is only blindly jealous and intent upon getting rid of anyone whom he wrongly perceives to be a threat to his throne. Continuing on in chapter 22, verses 11 through 23. Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard, and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priest of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep he struck with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day that when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul. I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me." After Saul browbeats his servants, Doeg discloses that David has gone to Ahimelech the high priest, who inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him sacred bread and the sword of Goliath. Saul has heard all he thinks he needs to know at this point. In his mind, not only did Ahimelech, but all the priests are part of the conspiracy against him. Ahimelech and the priests are all summoned to appear before Saul. It's hard to imagine what the ominous mood that must have been there when they were all called before Saul. We live in a country where the President of the United States can be questioned, opposed, and even removed from office. When he speaks, his opponents can boo him without fear of their lives. But this is not the case in the court of King Saul. It is one thing to have a madman in office whom you can restrain and even remove. It is another to have a madman dictator like Stalin, Nero, or Hitler. Such men hold absolute power. They can do whatever they please, even if it is irrational or even insane, and there is no one there to stop them. So it is with Saul. Saul is now a madman with no one to stop him. Saul rants about David and Jonathan, and even his servants begin being conspirators. Who is there to correct him? This madman now has an audience with the entire priesthood. On this occasion, it is not the priesthood that is there to pass judgment on Saul, but it is Saul who passes judgment on them. We can only attempt to appreciate the mood of terror that must have been there. that ominous sense of dread, which all who stand before Saul must feel on this occasion. Saul reveals his disdain for both David and Ahimelech by the way he addresses them. All the words in the Bible it's written for a reason. He calls them by their father's name, the son of Jesse, the son of Ahitub. In his sin offering, the sacrifices described in chapter 13, Saul makes himself equal to Samuel. In his dealings with Ahimelech and the priests here, Saul makes himself superior to all of them. He does not seek the facts of the case, but hastens to condemn the priests as traitors to the throne. Ahimelech responds with remarkable poise in this situation. He doesn't take this opportunity to cast blame on David for deceiving him, which, in fact, David actually did do. Ahimelech actually stands up to Saul, speaking on David's behalf, similar to what Jonathan did a couple of chapters ago. He reminds the king that David is not only his most faithful servant, but the man whom the people honor and whom Saul has promoted to positions of power and authority. If all else fails, Saul should at least remember that David is his own son-in-law. Ahimelech also speaks in his own defense and on behalf of the priests whom Saul has summoned. Ahimelech did not assist David by inquiring of the Lord for him, by giving him some sort of... He did assist David by inquiring for the Lord for him and by giving him the sacred bread and the sword of Goliath. But he did not knowingly assist David in any act of conspiracy. And the fact that he assisted David is nothing new or novel, let alone inappropriate. It is certainly not the first time David has come to him, asking him to inquire of the Lord. We can infer from this that David frequently sought divine guidance as he commenced his mission, or a mission for the king. Saul should not see this visit of David or Ahimelech's ministry to him as anything out of the ordinary or out of bounds, but he does. Ahimelech is right, and Saul is furious. The king pronounces the death sentence, not just upon Ahimelech, but upon all the priests who have gathered. It seems that this is Saul's intention from the outset. Saul orders the guards standing up to put the priest to death, but as much as these men fear Saul, they are not willing to put the priest to death. You have to imagine that there must have been an awkward period of silence when every man froze in his place, unwilling to carry out Saul's order. But we see that Saul would not be thwarted in his intentions, so he turned to Doeg and orders him to slay the priest, and Doeg complies. He does it. But Saul will now kill the David and any who support him, like the priests, and he will enlist the help of the Gentiles, if needed to do so. We're told that Doeg killed 85 priests that day. But that's not enough for Saul. His heart had turned so hard. He then goes to Nob, the city of priests, and proceeds to annihilate the families and even the cattle of these priests. Saul, the man who was not so zealous in killing the Amalekites, even though ordered to do so by God, is now zealous in killing the priests and even their cattle, even though it was forbidden to do so by God. We have to wonder, how far can Saul sink? And it's just another example of what jealousy can do to a person. Only one priest, Abiathar, survives, and he flees to David to tell him what Saul has done to the other priests. David assumes full responsibility, admitting that he had seen Doeg when he was at Nob, and that he knew this man would report to King Saul. There is nothing that David can do for those that have been slain, but he does offer sanctuary to Abiathar. So what can we take from this story? actually quite a few things. But before we get into the application, I want to read Psalm 142, verses 1 through 7. This is a prayer written by David when he was in the cave. Beginning in verse 1. I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare my trouble before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring my soul out of prison, so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. So one of the applications I believe we can take from this is how David reacts to his circumstances. When David finds himself in the most difficult circumstances, he most often does two things. For one, he cries out to the Lord, and secondly, he does what God wants him to do. Yes, we saw last week that David relied on his own wits to gain the food and supplies he needed. We also saw that he acted like he was insane to escape. But most often we see that David is seeking help from God. As we just read in David's prayer in Psalm 142, David did not turn away from God in the midst of trouble. Rather, he turned toward God. And when he turned to God, he cried out and was honest with God about how he felt about the situation that he was in. What we can learn from this is that whatever our situation, we can be honest with God. We can tell him how we feel about it. God hears and honors such vulnerability. We don't need to fake anything with God. He sees your heart. He knows what's there. There's the false Christian philosophy that is so often promoted today that says that the Christian life is just one silver-lined cloud after another, and that Christians always have to be positive and soaring. But we all know that that's just not true. It's not reality. Sometimes a Christian life includes a deep, dark cave. Sometimes we Christians find ourselves in a pit of pain and despair. We often find ourselves in that kind of place, but when we find ourselves in that kind of place, we can be honest with God about the situation, and we can be honest with each other about it as well. Lean on our brethren. That's what David did and said in verses 1 through 3 of Psalm 142. I cry out to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out my complaint before him. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who knows my way. The other thing that David does is he busies himself with the Lord's assignment. No matter where we are and no matter what is happening, God has an assignment for us. We simply need to be open to receive that assignment, to notice that assignment, and to complete the assignment. When David was led to the cave, he had no idea what jobs God was about to assign to him. But then it became quite obvious. God sent David his family, whom he needed to take to a place of protection. Then God sent David a motley crew of 400 difficult, distressed folks. What was this job? It was to minister to them, to give them direction, to train them for the future. David easily could have shirked these assignments. He could have been so caught up in himself and his own frustrations that he missed God's opportunities and assignments. He could have said, "No, I want things my way. and I'm not going to serve you until they are. So David is a great example for us when we find ourselves in difficult situations. In the midst of whatever is happening, we should be sure to stay honestly connected with God. We should look for the opportunities that God is giving us to serve. Therefore, we will not only be blessed in the midst of any situation, we will also be a blessing to others. And the other thing to close out is we can look at the situation with David reminding us of the situation with Jesus and his coming into this world. The captain of our salvation was rejected by men and crucified, but God lifted him up and placed him upon the throne and crowned him with glory and honor. And Jesus gathered himself a motley crew of malcontents and sinners like us. We aptly fit the description of those who were in distress, in debt, and discontented. Think of the kind of people who were attracted to Jesus during his ministry. They were sinners. They were outcasts of society. And those still tend to be the kind of people who are more likely to be open to the message of Christ today. Those who were powerful and viewed themselves as perfect were not the ones who came to Jesus, and they still don't. But look at what Jesus did with his band of uneducated, common outcast individuals. He created a community of love and truth that changed the world. And that continues to be the will of God and the will of God for the church, to create a caring community of love and truth that changes the world, one person at a time. People who are physically, emotionally, or spiritually in distress, debt, or discontented don't need a group of critics. They don't need more guilt or more piled-on distress. They are hurting enough already. What they need is a safe and secure environment. They need a place of encouragement. They need a place of refuge. They need a place to hide and to heal. That's what God is, and that's what God's people should be. God is our refuge, our shelter, our mighty rock, our fortress, our stronghold, our high tower. And with God as our refuge, we become a community of refuge. We here in this congregation can be that kind of people and that kind of place. Let's know God as our refuge and our strength. Let's run to him honestly and vulnerable with our vulnerabilities. And then let's continue to create a community of help and healing, a place for real people with real problems and real pain. Then, like David, we can say, "Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name." Next week, we'll pick up in chapter 23 and probably get into chapter 24. I thank you for your time.